Hello and welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. The countdown is well and truly on for US President Donald Trump's visit to India. Now, Trump would be in India on 24th and 25th February. In the last 20 years, every US president has visited India. It was Bill Clinton in 2000, George W. Bush in 2006, and Barack Obama twice in 2010 and 2015. Now, a grand welcome awaits Trump in India over the next few days. We'll try and revisit the India-US relationship in all its facets and dimensions: economic, strategic, cultural, and people-to-people ties. A distinguished panel of experts will help you, the viewer, know what it takes to be on top of the news. Now, joining me are Meera Shankar, a former Indian ambassador to the US, and Major General Dhruv Katoch, retired director of the India Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us on this discussion. Appreciate it. But first, as always, I want to bring you up to date on the news so far. US diplomat Alice Wells has said that the US and India enjoy a close partnership that is growing stronger by the day. She tweeted that the forthcoming visit by US President Donald Trump to India would further strengthen the relationship between the two countries. She said that India is at the heart of the Indo-Pacific region and it plays an increasingly prominent role on the world stage. The US looks forward to partnering with India at every step of the way. Now, Trump will be accompanied by First Lady Melania on their visit to India. President Trump will attend official engagements in New Delhi and Ahmedabad and interact with a wide cross-section of the Indian society. Right, US President Donald Trump has tweeted ahead of his visit to India as well. In a tweet, Trump said, and I quote here, "Great honor, I think. Mark Zuckerberg recently stated that Donald J. Trump is #1 on Facebook. #2 is Prime Minister Modi of India. Actually, I'm going to India in 2 weeks. Looking forward to it!" Exclamation mark, unquote. All right, I have now joined by two very special guests, Ambassador Meera Shankar and General Katoch. If I can come to you first, Ambassador Shankar. We've seen those tweets by President Trump and Alice Wells, the US diplomat in charge of South and Central Asian Affairs in the US State Department. If you can preview the visit for our viewers, what's in it for the US and India?
Well, firstly, the India-US relationship has become a very broad-based one.
Right.
It's not just at the level of political leaders, it is not just at the level of governments, it is not just at the level of business, it is also at the level of people.
Indeed.
So if you're looking at a really broad-based relationship where all these elements come into play, then the India-US relationship is clearly one. Now, all US presidents since President Clinton have visited India. And indeed, President Obama visited in each term of his. And in each of these visits, we've seen, something concluded which took the relationship to another level. So President Clinton addressed the joint parliamentary session where he talked of setting a new chapter in India-US relations. George Bush, saw progress on the nuclear deal. And President Obama actually reversed US policy to say that he supported India's permanent membership of the UN Security Council during his first visit to India. And on the second visit, the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific and the partnership for the Indo-Pacific was fleshed out and given shape. So I think it's important that President Trump does visit in his first term, and we hope that this relationship can build on the convergences, particularly in the strategic realm, which have opened up between the two countries in the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
Clearly, there are also divergences with regard to Russia, with India's purchase of weapons and systems from Russia,
Right.
with regard to Iran, with regard to what the potential US policy is going to be with regard to Afghanistan, and I'm sure all these issues will also be discussed. Economically, the US market has been the single largest market for Indian exporters, but our trade surplus with the US is marginal, around $20 billion or so, nowhere near China's, which is in the region of $300 billion or something like that. So I think to look at India-US trade from the point of view of balance or rectifying, I think is a bit misplaced, because the level of our trade and engagement is not that high. But yes, there were expectations of a mini trade deal, because it's important for India. It's our largest market, and one which also has synergies with our high-tech sector. So our IT sector, biotechnology sector, these have all grown with the linkage with the US market, not so much the Indian market itself. So it's important for us. For the US, they see India as a potentially large emerging market in the future, so they want to position themselves. But as of now, we are not very sure if the mini trade deal is going to actually work out, because the US trade representative has not come in the run up to the visit to finalize the details, and possibly it is that the US itself is going into election mode, and therefore their willingness to give concessions, to do trade-offs is perhaps more circumscribed at this juncture, making it difficult to reach conclusion. Defense deals will definitely be on the table, including perhaps for helicopters, and there's talk, because the US has sent to the Congress the notification for authorization of sale of integrated air defense systems, that might also be under discussion. So this area, the defense relationship, certainly I think we are going to see something. Now, a new element in recent years has been the US emerging as an energy partner, because of their development of shale gas and the fact that they are becoming surplus in energy.
Energy independent.
Yes, and so India has been looking to increase its energy imports from the US. We're also a very major buyer of aeroplanes, civilian aircraft as well. So I think these are areas where there's potential to increase the trade relationship.
Sure. General Katoch, as Ambassador Shankar pointed out, trade and defense could be the two main pillars or the takeaways from the Trump visit to India. Your take, your sense of what the visit is all about and what might be in it for both countries, India and the US?
I'm not so sure about the trade. I think the trade may not, I really don't think there's going to be any major agreement on trade, but there will be agreements on many other issues.
Right.
Getting onto this relationship, I think it'll be fair to understand the way this relationship has grown. That ever since India became independent, we were the world's largest democracy, and they are the oldest democracy, and there had been that very strong linkage between these two countries based on shared values and what the perception of people of each country had for the other. But politically, this didn't relate to the politics of it, actually. You see, we were on different poles, you can say. You see, the Americans were siding with the Pakistanis. They were part of CENTO and those alliances, and perforce we had to go with the USSR. And even when we come down to 1971, which I think was a very a low point in the strategic relationship between India and, I mean, there was no strategic relationship, but I think it was a low point in between the relationship where the Americans actually had to send the 7th Fleet to support a dictatorship which was committing genocide. But having said that, when we are looking at 2010 onwards, in fact, from 1991 onwards, there was a dramatic shift. Slowly and steadily, it started taking shape. And from 2010, we had the first strategic dialogue taking place, and from then it has been an upward journey. I mean, I really like the statements which have come across. Secretary Clinton calls it an indispensable partnership. President Obama, he says the defining partnership of the 21st century. And then later on, of course, we become the major defense partners. So what I'm thinking at is what the ambassador very correctly said. You know, we're looking at the future now, and what are the American concerns and what are Indian concerns, and where do those concerns converge?
Right.
I think two areas where they converge is, one is at the Indo-Pacific, as far as we are concerned, really the Indian Ocean region.
True.
And the second is on counter-terrorism. Now, there are two absolute convergent areas where the two countries are destined to cooperate, and I think we are going to see some movement here when the talks take place. There will certainly be a convergence as far as technology transfers are concerned, because this is one area where India has insisted on that we wanted high-end technology. Now, will the Americans be prepared? They have gone some distance. Will they be prepared to go further distance? They have already given support for India to be on the high table. Right. So will there be any I really don't know if there can be any further forward movement on that. But so long as the American support continues, I think it is a positive step.
Sure.
And I think we've also got similar convergences as far as perceived threats are concerned. The way America perceives the rise of China and its growing influence, which is not always considered benign in the Indian Ocean region. Here also, I think our interests converge as far as the US and America is concerned. So there will be talks on that. And lastly, of course, is the Americans trying to get out of Afghanistan. So what will they expect from India as far as Afghanistan is concerned? So I think as far as the range of talks is concerned, there's going to be a very broad range and a very wide range of strategic issues which will be discussed. I don't think trade is going to be a very major talking point as of now. This may take place at a later date. But on many other issues, I think there will be convergences. And while we may have differences on some issues, as earlier, our diplomacy is, and the American diplomacy can paper over those temporarily and get on to workable solutions. And I think that is what we are going to see during the visit of the President.
Absolutely. Ambassador Shankar, you've served in the Indian Foreign Service and you've handled the US affairs for a very long time to understand and appreciate that when two leaders meet, they can possibly discuss everything under the sun, but given the paucity of time, they may pick on the big picture issues. But talking about the so-called irritants or the divergences in the US, India-US ties, there's a lot of talk about the data localization issue, talk of social security issue, of visa issues in terms of India seeing it as a mobility issue and the US seeing it as a trade issue. And then the other issues of nuclear cooperation, space cooperation, and the outstanding issue of the NSG. So where would you see these issues being taken up in the days and months ahead?
I think they're really, not at a stage where we can reach agreement on many of these issues. I mean, data localization is something which is being discussed also at an international level. It's an issue between the US and Europe. How are we going to define the rules in future? So it's a subject of global negotiation, and countries which have the servers and the big companies in their space on their soil, like the US or China, have a view, and countries which don't have another view. So we have to see where this is going to lead, but it's clearly an important issue for India. There are issues of mobility, as you said, but I don't expect to see any easing on mobility by President Trump. And the interesting thing is that from what we know, it is the big three US companies which have been behind this, Google, Amazon, and others, which have really, Facebook, which have been behind this because they want to get a go at the H-1B before the Indian companies do. And whereas earlier India was, Indian companies were just trying to make a breakthrough. Now their level of exports have become much bigger, and they have emerged as competitors. So this loads the dice in favor of the American companies. So I don't expect to see these issues being resolved during the visit, but certainly they are it might figure when issues of trade come up. But I expect that if we don't have a trade deal, there could be an agreement to continue discussing these issues on a separate channel while we focus on the strategic convergences. And clearly Afghanistan, because that is something which is very imminent and topical. So I think that's going to be an issue for both countries.
Indeed. General Katoch and Ambassador Shankar, since we are discussing Afghanistan, I want to pause here and bring our viewers up to speed with the news about Afghanistan so far, and then I'll come back to you for discussion on Afghanistan. Now, U.S. Foreign Minister Mike Pompeo and Defense Minister Mark Esper met with Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani on 14th February on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference in Germany. The U.S. and the Taliban are in talks on an agreement for a U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the U.S. and the Taliban have agreed to a temporary truce. The U.S.-Taliban deal for a 7-day reduction of violence in Afghanistan will apply across the country, including Afghan government forces. The partial truce came after more than a year of talks between U.S. officials and the Taliban as they seek an end to what has become the U.S.'s longest war. The U.S. military will monitor the reduction in violence to ensure the Taliban upholds its commitments. Taliban had committed to a halt in roadside and suicide bombings as well as rocket attacks. Now, if the Taliban uphold their commitments, a U.S.-Taliban peace agreement would be soon signed. Now, meanwhile, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres hopes that the talks between the U.S. and Taliban would lead to a reduction of violence in Afghanistan. After meeting a delegation of Afghan refugees and representatives from Afghanistan, Yemen and Tajikistan, Guterres said that reduction in violence is critical to building confidence and support for a peace process. He said that such conditions would contribute to enabling the peaceful return of the displaced persons and refugees to their homes. Guterres also said that the United Nations remains committed to supporting an inclusive Afghan-led peace process that upholds human rights of all citizens and leads to a sustainable peace in Afghanistan. Well, if I can come to you now, General Katoch, your thoughts on the way forward in Afghanistan and how much would a difference will it make for India's interest in that country if the U.S. signs a peace deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan?
You know, coming to the second point first, an
Sure.
Afghan-led peace process. I think that has been India's stance all along.
True.
Unfortunately, it has never been Afghan-led. It has been led by everybody except the Afghans. And even now, when these peace talks have been going on between the United States and the Taliban, you find the government per se has been left outside. But I think America is also looking at its own interests. They want to get out. President Trump is going in for his second term. And I think this will be one of the points, one of his talking points, that I've got my troops out of Afghanistan. I've finished the longest war. This will be one of his planks for getting re-elected. So he will pull out all, I don't think he'll pull out all the stops, and he will do whatever he can to fulfill that. But having said that, what do you really mean by pulling out all troops? Is it 100%? Is it, I think they've got about 6,000 plus troops there now. So is he going to pull out every single last man, including all the contractors? Or will there be a small little force left behind? And in my assessment, I think some little force will be left behind, especially to give critical support in terms of intelligence and other, say, military fire support, etc., or in terms of drones or some other aspects. But as far as India is concerned, I think, you know, an American pullout is not good news. It is American presence there which has actually kept the situation under control. And in my own view, I do not think that the Afghan National Security Forces are in a position over a long term to defeat the Afghan Taliban without the American presence. There are two aspects to the Afghans, to the National Security Forces actually being able to hold their own. One is a limited presence of Americans, but they can still do without that if they have the requisite financial support, which come to about USD 3 billion every year, to maintain these forces. Now, the Afghan government doesn't have that money, but that is the force which is currently required to maintain or to at least keep the Taliban at check. And without that money coming in, I think it is a matter of time when the forces will disintegrate, because armies are known to disintegrate, and police forces also when they are not paid. So I think that is going to be a very, very disturbing trend as far as I am concerned. The second point, you know, when we are looking at what the statement which came out from the United Nations, that an inclusive Afghan-led peace effort. I mean, you know, my problem in this whole inclusiveness is that when we are looking at the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government, The divergences are too broad. Basically, it revolves on one point, ideology. The Taliban want the Sharia. The Afghan government does not. Now, will there be any compromise on that? I don't see the Taliban compromising on this one fundamental agenda. They may compromise and say, okay, we will give women the rights, they will go to school, they won't wear the burqa and all that business. On Sharia, there will be no compromise. Now, can the other party go with it? I really don't know. So, as a long-term measure, whether the Americans go out or they don't go out, if they don't go out, we will maintain the present rate of attrition, hostility, but by and large, when Afghanistan is at war with itself, the rest of the world is at peace.
Sure.
Now, when we find that over a period of time, the Americans come out, the Afghan Taliban will keep getting stronger and stronger. Ultimately, it will become a Taliban state. Then I think there will be a problem for the rest of the world, not just India. We are in a better position to handle it now than what we were earlier. And that is specifically because of the special act, the provisions which have taken place in Jammu and Kashmir with the abrogation of 35A and dilution of 370.
Sure.
And splitting the state into 2 union territories. You see, that has markedly changed the dynamics within the state. And because of that, we are in a better position to handle any adverse fallout in terms of terrorist influx or something. So I really don't view that as a very major challenge. That is something which we can handle far better now. And I do not think it will be attempted also.
All right, fair point. Ambassador Shankar, a quick comment from you on Afghanistan. The twin issues of the mainstreaming of the Taliban and the American pullout from Afghanistan. Should India be worried at all?
Well, the thing is that if the American pullout is very precipitate, without safeguards and without leaving behind a reasonably sustainable situation, then you could have a kind of chaos in which the Taliban could assume a larger than life dimension, because in the whole process of bringing the Taliban within the political process, I think the effort is that it should be a pluralistic process where other parties are also able to operate in the political sphere, that it's not just a single entity driven polity, and that the Taliban gives up arms and terrorism and safeguards for minorities including women and Shias or Hazaras are all maintained. How much of this will remain, I really don't know, but I think for the Americans, they have to be conscious that, like in Iraq, where they withdrew their troops and then created a vacuum which eventually also gave rise to ISIS, where they had to come back in and they are still fighting ISIS.
True.
So I think they have to be conscious that whatever they do does not lead to a kind of unsustainable situation in Afghanistan. Now that's easier said than done. Nobody really knows how to create a sustainable situation. As of now, the Americans are saying their withdrawal is going to be conditions based. They will keep gauging to what extent the Taliban is adhering to their part of the bargain before going ahead with the next phase of withdrawal. And there's also talk that they might keep some minimal presence for counter-terrorism and intelligence purposes. So let's see where this goes. But clearly from India's point of view, a precipitate and complete withdrawal without creating reasonably sustainable situation or sustainable situation on the ground would be something which is undesirable.
All right. I'm afraid I'm completely running out of time. So one last question to both my guests, starting with you, General Katoch. Your expectations from the Trump visit to India and the Trump-Modi relationship, their chemistry, so to speak, how that might keep India-US ties on an even keel going forward as well?
I think I'll talk about the relationship between between the Prime Minister and the President first.
Sure.
I think that is a very important component of the relationship,
True.
and because the two leaders pull on so well together, which is very rare actually when you're looking into leaders of such different countries and such different capacities and such different mindsets, but they are totally at ease with each other, and I think that's a very important component.
Sure.
The second thing, I think it'll do wonders for both the countries. I mean, we are natural allies. We are democracies. Our people like each other, you know, and I think that's something which we need to build on.
Absolutely.
So there is that trust factor, people-to-people trust factor is very strong. The trust factor between the two leaders is very strong. Our diplomacy has really, as far as the Indian diplomacy is concerned, you know, it has risen up to this challenge. It has done very well. And I think that this visit will do a world of good
Sure.
to both the countries.
Sure. Ambassador Shankar, your thoughts on the Trump-Modi bonhomie that might be the key driver of the relationship going forward?
Well, I think there is that was on display during the Howdy Modi
Absolutely.
event in the US. But relationships are built on more than personal factors, and the point is that at the moment there are increasing convergences between India and the US and a broad basis for the relationship. So that helps the leaders also
True.
to build a closer relationship. I think President Trump is going into an election year, so some of the public events will clearly be also with a mind to his domestic constituency and how it plays out
Right.
in the US. And here the Indian American community is clearly, it's not so large, it's about 3 to 4 million.
But it's a force to reckon with.
But yes, they are important in the political
They come
arena.
of
They are,
age, yeah.
they are far more active than they used to be, and actively involved in fundraising and many other political activities. Traditionally, the Indian American community has been pro-democrat. The rich Indian Americans, you know, doctors and so on, have tended to vote Republican, but the bulk of the Indian American community has voted Democrat. They're in the universities, they are academics, the professional classes and so on. So I suppose Trump is also keeping an one eye.
Absolutely.
President Trump would also be keeping one eye on that.
Indeed.
I think it's important in this whole process also to stress that the relationship has enjoyed bipartisan support.
True.
From President Clinton, President Bush, you know, President Obama, and now President Trump, so that the relationship doesn't become a divisive issue in US politics.
All right, on that note, Ambassador Shankar and General Katoch, thank you so much for joining me on the discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time. And that's a wrap on this special broadcast. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.